History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Matt.
We're not historians. We're just two guys who enjoy a great story and plenty of laughs.
This is History's B-Side.
Today's B-Sider is The Enchantress of Number.
Before we get into today's topic, since she is one of the pioneers of computing and specifically computer programs and algorithms, I wanted to get your take on humanity's continued use of computers and computing and how it's changed, I guess, our culture and specifically your life and my life, our lives. I think it's definitely become a kind of a hot topic right now with all the Google, Facebook algorithm stuff going on and you know, our kind of rethinking our relationship with technology with the pandemic and everything.
Well, I'm sure computers now versus computers, as I'm sure we'll talk in this episode, are very different. Like what we think of a computer now is obviously not the same thing. And like our phones even are computers now. Like it's more than just a phone. So it's hard to imagine any world now or in the future that doesn't involve computers, barring like a, I don't know, cataclysmic nuclear winter or something like that just completely resets the earth. But yeah, I don't know. Computers are pretty much everywhere. It's in everything that we use now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize how intertwined they are with our mode of operating. I think some people kind of jump on the bandwagon of being anti-technology, and I understand the need to be careful with it and to make sure you still have a life outside of social media and all of that, but to say you're like anti-computer or be against its use is virtually impossible at this point. You can't do anything unless you live in the woods and provide for yourself completely without...
It's almost more work to not use computers at this point. Like you have to actively avoid them.
Well, and that's the thing. I think that's for most of the people we're going to talk about today and most of the pioneers was the idea is that this was an augmentation of human capability. In preparation for this, I watched a video that was kind of discussing the original history of them. And it started off by saying, you know, before the 1930s, if you wanted a computer, you just hired a human being to sit at a desk and do mathematical calculations with a pencil. And that was, I guess, effective, but very slow. And computing allowed us to exponentially expand our ability to calculate numbers and then later on symbols and ideas. And it just made it almost, you know, when you look into it, feels like we invented our own superpower using this technology. Because like, truly, if you went back 200 years or 300 years or 1,000 years to, you know, the ancient Greeks, they would have thought you were some sort of sorcerer with this crazy machine. And now we have them in our pockets. So you don't even need a crazy machine. You can just, I mean, you would seem like some sort of magician.
And now you have all our parents and grandparents who think that we're some kind of sorcerers because we know how to use these phones and computers and whatnot. I actually just heard something that was like the government just sent out free testing kits or free N95 masks or something, but you had to order them online. Yeah. And that was a huge problem because the population that needs them most are older generations who don't know how to order things online. So they had to set up like a phone line that people could access, but they have a hard time getting the word out about the phone line to do that because you need the internet to get information out now.
Yeah, I mean, it really is an completely pervasive thing now in our society. And I think we'll only continue to be that. Like, I've, in an effort to understand like this metaverse concept and blockchain technology, I've listened to several podcasts and done some reading. And two things that kind of stuck out to me, I feel like I might have talked to you about the one, but the younger generation is spending on average like 10 hours a day on either social media or some sort of video game platform like Fortnite or Roblox or whatever. And you can see it in my, like, the people I know with children or my younger family members. I mean, they're way better at using this technology than we were. And one of the things I read is that the generation now that's like growing up, even as old as like 16, are better, like more naturally adept at using touchscreens than they are keyboards and mouses, to the point where they're actually having a problem getting people to understand how to code that are younger because the keyboard is such a outdated piece of technology for them because they've used touchscreens their whole life, and they're trying to figure out how to make programming more intuitive with a touchscreen for that reason.
It's the new version of cursive. Like we were taught how to use cursive, but none of us, like no one in our generation actually writes in cursive, so it's kind of been a forgotten thing. It's funny to think that keyboards are becoming the new cursive, where these younger generations I'm sure are taught in school how to use a keyboard, but they might never actually use one later in life.
Yeah. And so I feel like, I mean, we're headed for a new, I think, era of technology pretty soon in the next 10 to 20 years that we can't even understand or foresee. And I'm already like, I feel like an old man when I try to read about this because it makes so little sense to my brain.
Yeah, that's crazy.
There's a podcaster that I was listening to who said, I feel like the part of my brain that could understand this stuff is dying. And that's kind of how I feel, where I'm like, I feel like a 6-year-old would just be like, well, yeah, of course. And I'm like, but I don't understand it.
That part of your brain is just filled with stuff you don't need anymore. Like writing cursive.
But I guess I wanted to take today's episode and talk about a good B-sider in the history of computing, because I've heard her name come up a couple times, but there's not a lot of information out there, and she kind of fits in with her story as far as being immediate backup to an A-sider of sorts, which would be Charles Babbage. But before we get into her story, I wanted to talk about two of the other kind of pioneers of computing that you might have heard of. The first would be Alan Turing, who, as many people might know, developed the Enigma code-breaking machine during World War II. The Enigma machine was a German kind of typewriter-esque machine that basically encoded messages, and it was changed every day. So even if British spies found the setting to the machine, it would change at midnight the next day. So they would have to find the code every day, bring it back, use it to break codes, and then do the same thing every 24 hours, and it just wasn't working. So Alan Turing's team developed a machine that could quickly, within like 2 to 4 hours, break the code, find the settings for the machine, allowing the British intelligence officers to decode messages. And
that's cool.
How this works completely escapes me. If you want to know a little bit more about his story, there's a really great movie called The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch playing Alan Turing. And it's a great look into his work and his machine, but also into kind of the personal struggles he went through in his life, because he was a very unique human in the way his mind works. He wasn't very socially adept, and he was also a gay man. And at the time in Britain during World War II, that wasn't exactly something. I mean, I believe at the time it was still illegal. So he definitely had his share of personal troubles as well. But it's a really great movie, and I highly recommend people check it out.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a cool story.
The second would be a more direct predecessor to the modern electronic digital computer. Turing's machine was largely mechanical in nature, and the idea of having like a switchboard or a motherboard with electronic signals in it wasn't developed until a little bit later, when a machine called the Atanisov-Berry computer, or ABC, was developed by physics professor John Vincent Atanisov and his graduate student Clifford Berry in 1942. So just a short time after Alan Turing's machine. But this was, I mean, these machines were built basically to run what we would look back on today as fairly simple programs. They were essentially really complicated, really large, unwieldy calculators. And most of them were designed to do simple, I mean, fairly complex for a human, but for a computer, simple mathematical equations. And that's what the ABC machine did. It was able to give you an idea of what I mean by simple for a computer, it was able to solve mathematical problems with up to 29 different variables. So when you're doing algebra, right, you get like 2y equals 14, and you can establish that y is 7.
We've had issues on our podcast with us doing mental math, and I'm like listening to you talk about this. I'm like, yeah, like that computes.
Yeah. So imagine an equation with 29 different variables, and the ABC was able to do those equations. It also weighed over 700 pounds and had giant vacuum tubes and a rotating drum that were a little bigger than paint cans. So it wasn't something that you could buy at Best Buy and take home to your house.
Imagine these people looking at a cell phone today and being like, that fits in your pocket and it can do all that.
I mean, it really is incredible. And one of the reasons why Atanasov is important is that he kind of developed this idea of binary code or binary digits. And that really can be looked at as the foundation for all other programs that we use, like HTML or Python, or for Mike Slavin's Java. You got to update your Java. Yeah. And so binary is essentially the process of breaking electricity into information. So you only have two options with electricity. It's either there or it's not. It's on or it's off. And so you get zeros, which is off, ones, which are on, and that's how everything else is built. Just with little, transistors that are either on or off based on whether there's electricity flowing through them. And it's crazy to me that idea is now, there's millions of them in my pocket. Like, I have a device that can play music and watch YouTube and send a message and save data and run a timer all at the same time.
I didn't realize that's what binary code was, or that's what it does. I just always understood it as like a language that computers read or speak, but it's only like 8 or 10 digit codes of ones and zeros or something instead of actual letters. It's
broken into eight digit things. That's what a bit is. Or no, I'm sorry. That's what a byte is. A bit is one of those digits. A byte is a section of 8 of those. So if you have like a whatever gigabyte computer, that's what that means, is that it has that many of those digit chunks put together. And there's a lot of good videos online if you want to make a little bit more sense of this. A lot of it has to do with like logical calculation. But if you think about the fact that if you have one light bulb that's on or off, you can only represent two values, 0 and 1. But if you have 2, now you could have 4.
You'd have the option for light bulb 1 to be on and light bulb 2 to be off, and light bulb 1 to be off and light bulb 2 to be on, both off. So yeah, you can see how that would.
So as you get more
trigger
digits,
a lot
it
more.
It exponentially expands. And so the early pioneers wrote a pretty standard code for what binary digits could represent, first starting with numbers, then the alphabet and other characters that we would use to communicate information. And that turned into what is now, modern coding languages that are much closer in comparison to human language. They might not look it when you look at them, but it's not as complex as writing in binary. And that's part of the contribution that Ada made. We'll talk later about the fact that her program was elegant and simple. And that is a big thing in the computing world. You can have a program that does, a certain task, and it's, if you wrote it in binary, it would be hundreds of thousands of lines long maybe, but then if you write it in a different way or use certain algorithms, it can be shorter. You get the same result with less work and less, redundancy in a program. And that's kind of what computer programming is all about, is finding coding solutions to make problems simpler to solve.
Seems like a lot of work.
It's taken us 60 years, more now, 70, 80 years, to get from using binary to listening to Adele's new album on our smartphone,
or History's B-Side podcast.
There you go. You're listening to this because of code. So I want to jump into her story. She was born, and this I found really fascinating, Augusta Ada Byron on December 10th, 1815, to Lord and Lady Byron.
Lord Byron is very familiar, it's a familiar name to me, but I can't think of who he is.
So George Gordon Byron, or Lord Byron, was a poet. He was one of the, 18th century. Yeah, he was born in 1788, died 1824. So didn't live very long. Died at the age of 36. He was known mostly for his lengthy narrative poem Don Juan, which is one of the things I studied in my English classes in college.
That's probably why I know the name.
He was also kind of a piece of shit. Like, like some other writers, definitely loved to party, loved to drink, and was specifically known for his sexual exploits, and was kind of a as we would say today, player. Like, I mean, he, was always with different women, and that was kind of his hallmark, was sleeping around. So
well, he would have been like a celebrity of the day, so that was kind of his, like,
yeah,
I don't know, thing.
Yeah, for any of you that have seen the Dirt, which is about Motley Crue, Lord Byron is like an 1800s version of Motley Crue. He slept with everything that moved. So I guess it's not surprising that doing this led him to have some children that were famous. But I found it interesting that this connection, like, she's born of this other kind of hugely well-known poet that I didn't even know was connected to him until I researched for this. As all good dads in the 1800s, Lord Byron expected his child to be a glorious boy, and was disappointed when Lady Byron gave birth to a girl. The child was named after Byron's half-sister, Augusta Lee, and was called Ada by Byron himself. On the 16th of January 1816, at Lord Byron's command, Lady Byron left for her parents' home at Kirkby Mallory, taking their 5-week-old daughter with her. Although English law at the time granted full custody of children to the father in cases of separation, Lord Byron made no attempt to claim his parental rights, but did request that his sister keep him informed of Ada's welfare. On the 21st of April, Lord Byron signed the deed of separation, although very reluctantly, and left England for good a few days later.
This is all, I guess, kind of a sad example of women's place in marriage at the time, but why was he reluctant to separate if he wanted to leave?
I mean, there's no direct answer to this online, but I kind of assume it was just the moral aspect of leaving his offspring behind, leaving his family behind, even though I said previously he was kind of a piece of shit. I think maybe he had a not piece of shit side that made him not super excited to leave this family behind, but I didn't find a direct answer to that.
It's weird.
I don't know if there were any like ulterior motives. I guess that is. Lady Byron, her mother, continued throughout her life to make allegations about her husband's immoral behavior. This set of events made Lovelace infamous in Victorian society. Ada did not have a relationship with her father, who died in 1824 when she was 8 years old. Her mother was the only significant parental figure in her life. And she didn't have a close relationship with her mother either. She was often left in the care of her maternal grandmother, Judith, Honorable Lady Milbanke, who doted on her. However, because of societal attitudes at the time, which favored the husband in any separation with the welfare of any child acting as mitigation, Lady Byron had to present herself as a loving mother to the rest of society.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so usually societal attitudes favored the husband as far as taking custody of a child, with the child's welfare being the one thing that could change that. So because he signed these papers of separation, her mother had a chance to take on custody, but her mother kind of had to prove that she was fit to parent, or risk losing custody of Ada to Lord Byron because of the societal attitudes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so Ada would have gone to wherever her dad took off to, or someone else would have gotten custody of her?
I believe so. Either that or she would have ended up an orphan. I'm not 100% sure. But
probably the orphan thing, let's be honest.
Because I think today we kind of look at it the other way, where usually mothers are given preferential custody in a lot of cases. It wasn't so then, so her mother really had to try to make it at least appear that she was a caring, loving, good mother. And she did try to make it appear that way.
Right.
This included writing anxious letters to Lady Milbanke about her daughter's welfare, with a cover note saying to retain the letters in case she had to use them to show maternal concern. In one letter to Lady Milbanke, she referred to her daughter as it, Quote, I talk to it for your satisfaction, not my own, and shall be very glad when you have it under your own. Like, what? This is bonkers. These people are terrible people.
Yeah, I mean...
Lady Byron, too. They're both terrible.
That's sad. Do you know, did Ada have other siblings as well, or was she the only child?
From Lady and Lord Byron, she had no other siblings. I think she probably had, just given Byron's,
sexual
Byron's
promiscuity.
Habits, I think it's likely that she had step siblings, but in fact she did. Actually, I have a list of his children: Allegra Byron and Elizabeth Medora Lee, which would both be half sisters.
Okay, but not raised by the two of them, I assume.
Right.
Lord and Lady Byron.
Oh, and Elizabeth Medora Lee was most likely fathered by Lord Byron and his half-sister, Augusta Lee. So there you go. There it is, wrapped up in a bow for you.
All right.
Oh, Lord Byron. So back to Lady Byron. She even had Ada, as a teenage woman, watched by close friends for any sign of moral deviation. Lovelace dubbed these observers the Furies, and later complained they exaggerated or invented stories about her. Ada was often ill, beginning in early childhood. At the age of 8, she experienced headaches that obscured her vision. In June of 1829, she was paralyzed after a bout of measles.
Do you know what would have caused that?
I don't know what caused the headaches. The measles was what led to the paralysis, but I don't know if they were connected.
So I don't know much about measles. That's a communicable disease, I assume. So it was probably just prevalent in the area. Okay.
Yes, and they didn't have a vaccine for it at the time, so it was a bigger deal than it needed to be.
Touch a nerve there.
Ada was subjected to continuous bed rest for nearly a year, something which may have extended her period of disability, which is another thing from this time period that blows my mind, is that like bed rest was just the solution for everything. And there were probably, thousands of people, especially women, that were suffering from depression and then given bed rest for depression, which would just make it worse. Luckily, by 1831, she was able to walk with the use of crutches. And despite this illness, she developed her mathematical and technological skills. When Ada was 12 years old, she decided she wanted to fly, literally. Ada Byron went about the project methodically, thoughtfully, with imagination and passion. Her first step in February of 1828 was to construct wings. Now, she's 13 at the time. So she's making wings, 13 years old. Seems great, right?
Would they attach to her?
I believe so. There's not like a drawing of her machine or whatever you want to call it, her wings.
Like a backpack kind of?
I guess. But she did, for a 13-year-old, did a lot of good research. She investigated different materials and sizes and considered various materials for the wings, including paper, oil silk, wires, and feathers. She examined the anatomy of birds to determine the right proportion between the wings and the body. So I imagine that they were attached to her body.
That would be huge.
To be the right proportion, yeah.
Yeah.
She decided to write a book, aptly named Flyology, illustrating with plates some of her findings. She decided what equipment she would need. For example, a compass to cut across the country by the most direct road, so that she could surmount mountains, rivers, and valleys. Her final step was to integrate steam with the art of flying.
So did she actually attempt this and succeed in flying?
She did not attempt it and did not succeed.
Oh.
As impressive as all of this is for a 13-year-old, she's still a 13-year-old.
Well, clearly her story goes on. She didn't jump off a cliff and hope her wings worked. But...
Yeah, she did not leap from a mountain. But this did lead to an interest in technology and mathematics and science. From 1832, when she was 17, her mathematical abilities began to emerge, and her interest in mathematics dominated the majority of her adult life. Her mother's obsession with rooting out any of the insanity of which she accused Byron was one of the reasons that Ada was taught mathematics from an early age.
I don't really see the connection between her being taught mathematics and rooting out insanity.
I think the idea was that by teaching her math and science, it would keep her on a straighter path than her father went. Her mother was very paranoid, maybe rightly so, that Byron's poor behavior, poor moral ethics would be passed on to Ada, or were present in Ada, and her early disabilities only served to stoke her mother's obsession with this fear. So there's not a lot of sense in it, but I think her mother saw education as a way to fortify her against the craziness and insanity of her father's life.
I think that's a recurring theme in a lot of history, that poets are kind of crazy.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. There's actually a great, I can't remember the name of the movie right now, but there's a movie about this kid that wants to be a poet, and he's like glorifies all of these old writers like Lord Byron and all of the old British poets. And at some point his teacher just freaks out on him and is like, none of these people were good men. They were all drunkards, immoral. The kid's like dreams are shattered because all of these guys that he thinks are so great were really just probably severely mentally ill addicts.
I know we referenced this a lot last week, but listeners, go back and listen to Peer Gynt and Dietrich Eckart from our Nazism episode.
It's where the starving, struggling, addicted artist trope comes from.
I guess.
Back to Ada. She was privately educated in mathematics and science by William Friend, William King, and Mary Somerville, the noted 19th century researchers and scientific authors. In the 1840s, the mathematician Augustus de Morgan extended her much help in the mathematical studies, including study of advanced calculus topics, including the numbers of Bernoulli, which formed her celebrated algorithm for Babbage's analytical engine. In a letter to Lady Byron, De Morgan suggested that Ada's skills in mathematics might lead her to become, quote, an original mathematical investigator, perhaps of first-rate eminence. Lovelace often questioned basic assumptions through integrating poetry and science. Little touch from her dad, I suppose. Whilst studying differential calculus, she wrote to De Morgan, I may remark that the curious transformations many formula can undergo, the unsuspected and to a beginner apparently impossible identity of forms exceedingly dissimilar at first sight, is, I think, one of the chief difficulties in the early part of mathematical studies. I am often reminded of certain sprites and fairies one reads of, who are at one's elbow in one shape now, and the next minute a form most dissimilar. So she starts comparing mathematical ideas to fairies and sprites in poetry that she might have been familiar with. And I think this kind of feeds her passion and makes math a little bit more interesting to her, maybe, than we might see it.
It's weird to think that idea of comparing something very objective like math to fairies and sprites and things you'd find in poetry, like it's weird to think that people took her seriously beyond that point, that that was a legitimate way to understand math.
Yeah, and I think that goes to show what level of math she was working on, because she was beyond a lot of the math we would consider to be straightforward and logical and calculating, into this land of like algorithms and really intense calculus where there might not always be an exact answer, which is kind of the part of math that is still fogged by clouds in my brain. But I think it helped her as far as being able to be innovative and invent programs later on in her life. In fact, Ada believed that intuition and imagination were critical to effectively applying mathematical and scientific concepts. She valued metaphysics as well as mathematics, viewing both as tools for exploring the unseen world around us, as she described it. Now, before we take our break, some of you might be asking, if she was born to Lord and Lady Byron, why is her last name Lovelace?
I was wondering.
So on July 8th, 1835, Ada married a man by the name of William, 8th Baron King, which would have made her Lady King. Ada happened to be descended from the Barons Lovelace, and with this marriage, William became the Earl of Lovelace in 1838, and with him, Ada became the Countess of Lovelace, which is where the name comes from. So at this time, she would have taken this name on, and that became her name for the rest of her life, and the name she would be known by in her research. I don't know enough about British nobility to explain that process to you.
No, me either, but I do think they tend to take on the territory that they are technically in nobility of and make that their last name. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the current royal family, but like they would be the Duke and Duchess of whatever, and that is kind of that area's how they're known. So this makes sense, I think, to me.
I think it was just a matter of once she became a married woman, especially to a baron, she was able to reach back into her ancestry and pull the Lovelace family and the baron's,
right,
name back out of her history. And as Baron and Countess, the two owned 3 homes, one in Ockham Park, Surrey, a Scottish estate, and a home in London. They also had 3 children together, sons Byron and Ralph Gordon, and daughter Annabella, who we will talk about briefly later on in her life.
So she must not have had too terrible feelings towards her father if she named one of her children Byron.
I don't understand her relationship with her father, because she ends up getting buried next to him at the end of her life. And that seems to me to at least imply some level of respect. But he was terrible and left, and she never had a relationship with him. I almost feel like because he really wasn't involved in her life at all, compared to her mother, who was involved but was kind of terrible, she probably started to develop negative feelings towards her mother. And because her mom was so obsessed with how immoral and insane her father was, this almost feels like maybe it was a move out of spite towards her mom. I don't know that for sure. It's just kind of how I see the situation maybe playing out.
Probably some patriarchal ideology of the time too, that
yeah.
She would always be loyal to her father.
Yeah. So on this episode, we're going to talk a bit about Ada Lovelace's computer program, the algorithm she wrote, and why it mattered. And some of the controversy around whether or not she was the first to develop a computer program. But before we get to that, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. So our listeners are pretty used to hearing us talk about what we're drinking on the episodes that we record. And usually it's beer, wine, or some sort of spirit. Sometimes that has to do with the B-sider of the day. But today I'm just drinking a cup of coffee. And to be honest with you, Phil, it's the single worst cup of coffee I think I've made for myself in several years.
Oh no, is it truck stop coffee? Because I've had a lot of experience drinking truck stop coffee recently.
Honestly, I don't know how I did it, but this might be worse than truck stop coffee. It doesn't have the metallic taste, but it's definitely, it's on par with a terrible gas station cup of coffee.
That sounds disgusting.
It's delightful.
Maybe you should buy some coffee, or someone should buy you coffee.
You know what? I like that second option a little bit better. And it works out because we're here today to tell our listeners about a new listener support service we're using called Buy Me a Coffee. And you can find us and buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
And it's cool because there's a couple different ways that our listeners can get involved and support the show. Number one, you could just donate to the show by clicking Buy Them a Coffee.
2, you can join as a member with levels starting at $5 per month. A few of the membership perks include monthly bonus episode titled History's B-Side Battles, in which we debate to see which B-sider would come on top in a battle royale to the death. You also get access to our future episode queue, discounts on extras on our online shop, and History's B-Side gifts and swag.
And those extras, like you mentioned, include things like choosing topics for future episodes. You can buy custom postcard sets or stickers, and we even have some things like coffee mugs or some future merch that we're going to add on there as we go. And you obviously don't have to be a member to get those things, but if you are a member, you get a discount on them, and it's actually a much better deal, 25 to 50% off what you would if you weren't a member.
It's a great way for our listeners to support us in a more casual way and make sure that we're not recording while drinking terrible cups of coffee like the one I have in my hand right now.
The website again is buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. We so appreciate your support. It's what helps us continue to put these episodes on every single week and continue our research and make sure you're learning about all the cool people from history that we sometimes forget.
With that said, let's get back to today's B-sider. All right, welcome back. So when we left off, we we're covering a lot of Ada Lovelace's earlier life and her education and start in the world of mathematics and science. Now we're going to go into a little bit about her accomplishments that made her famous. So as I said earlier, one of the things she's most known for is creating what many consider to be the first computer program. There's some contention around whether or not that's true, and we'll talk about why. And I guess decide ourselves and let our listeners decide if Ada Lovelace actually did create the first computer program, or if she was just one of the researchers that got us further along the way to creating them. So Ada Lovelace first met Charles Babbage, who's considered one of the fathers of computing, in June 1833 through their mutual friend Mary Somerville, whom Lovelace had earlier studied with.
Charles Babbage is actually on my list of people I wanted to research for future episodes.
Oh,
as
really?
like the father of computing. Yeah, so I mean, I'm guessing that there's a lot of overlap in their stories, so I don't know, maybe I won't do an episode on him, but I'm glad that you chose this topic because it seems like her story might be a little bit more like the underling to his story.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I chose her. It seems kind of like I don't want to say like Lizzie Maggie because the relationship is much different, but she kind of came up with these ideas. I guess it's more like Rosalind Franklin.
Yeah, that's kind of who I thought of too.
Where she's, kind of doing this research, but not really getting the credit for it. So Lovelace meets Babbage, and later that month, he invites her to see the prototype for his difference engine. She became fascinated with the machine, and used her relationship with Somerville to visit Babbage as often as she could. Babbage was impressed by Lovelace's intellect and analytical skills. He called her the Enchantress of Number. And that's where we got our episode title from.
Ooh, love when they say the name of the show or movie or whatever in the movie.
Yeah. In 1840, Charles Babbage was invited to give a seminar at the University of Turin about his analytical engine. Luigi Menabrea, a young Italian engineer and the future Prime Minister of Italy, transcribed Babbage's lecture into French in the Bibliothèque Universelle de Genève in October 1842. Babbage's friend Charles Wheatstone commissioned Ada to translate Menabrea's paper into English. During a 9-month period in 1842 and 1843, Lovelace translated the Italian mathematician Luigi Menabrea's article on Babbage's newest proposed machine, the Analytical engine. With the article, she appended a set of notes. Explaining the Analytical engine's function was a difficult task, as many other scientists did not really grasp the concept, and the British establishment had shown little interest in it. And I'm going to take this moment to note that I don't really grasp the concept
I was going to say, I feel that same way.
Lovelace's notes even had to explain how the Analytical engine differed from the original difference engine. Her work was well received at the time. The scientist Michael Faraday described himself as a supporter of her writing. Ada Lovelace spent the better part of a year doing this, assisted with input from Babbage.
So when you say analytical engine and difference engine, these are two machines, right? Are these just early
Yes.
computers, or what were they? How would we view them?
Essentially, they're both early computers. The analytical machine is kind of a progression from the difference machine towards what we now know of as computers. So they were really just, I don't know, if you think about them as progressive models that can do more and more.
They sound like calculators to me.
I mean, pretty much at this point, they would be what is considered a calculator. The main difference, especially the difference engine, now I'm going to say difference a lot apparently, is that the difference engine mainly was just a calculator. It was a mechanical machine. It actually couldn't even do multiplication and division functions. The only thing it could do was add, and through adding, get to different calculations.
I think that's how a lot of modern calculators work, though, is just through using addition. I mean, I don't fully understand it myself, but it would be like to do a subtraction function, you're just adding a negative, right?
Right.
And then multiplication is just a series of additions. So
that's true.
I guess I understand that point, but it sounds like it wouldn't be super functional, I guess.
Yeah, and they were really revolutionary at the time, but from what we consider today as a computer, they were fairly useless. All they could really do was simple mathematical calculations based on how they were originally designed. So it wasn't like a computer today where you can change it and program it to do different tasks. And that's where the analytical engine came in. The analytical engine was the first form of the computer that was actually programmable to do different functions. It didn't just have to do addition. It could run algorithms, it could follow instructions, and it even was, a form of early computer that had memory and could store information. So it was definitely a step up from the difference engine. And that piece of the analytical engine that allows it to be programmable is one of the more important parts of what Ada would write about. So like I said, with the article, she appended a set of notes, and these notes, which are more extensive than Menabrea's paper, were then published in the September 1843 edition of Taylor's Scientific Memoirs under the initialism AAL. So it's kind of crazy to me that she is writing notes about this paper and ends up writing more than the paper.
Gotta explain it to nincompoops like us.
Yes, nincompoops. Ada's notes were labeled alphabetically from A to G. In note G, she describes an algorithm for the analytical engine to compute Bernoulli numbers. And for those of you who don't know what Bernoulli numbers are, you join me in not really understanding them. Essentially, they're a set of rational numbers that come up often in a certain type of mathematical analysis. To explain that further would take another full episode, and I am not qualified to do it. So
people who know math are listening to this and thinking we're dumb, and people who don't know math are listening to this and thinking, I don't really care to know this either.
It's pretty standard. I'm sure there's plenty of great videos out there to explain better than I can what Bernoulli numbers are. But for now, just remember that they're a series of rational numbers that are used in mathematical calculations and analysis. So she writes this algorithm to compute the Bernoulli numbers. It is considered to be the first published algorithm ever specifically tailored for implementation on a computer, and Ada Lovelace has often been cited as the first computer programmer for this reason. Others dispute this because some of Charles Babbage's earlier writings could be considered computer programs.
This kind of feels like semantics for giving one of them credit. What makes something a quote-unquote computer program that one of them would get credit over the other?
Yeah, I was actually talking to a friend who does recruiting work for the tech industry a couple of days ago, and one of the things he said was, in computer science, it's all about how you define it. And I feel like this kind of fits into that idea that everything's kind of variable depending on what definitions you give it. I think the main difference here, to me, seems to be that Charles' writings weren't designed to be implemented on a computer. They were more the description of the computer. So the program was the computer's design itself, whereas she wrote a program that could be implemented on a machine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example for that. It would be almost like, I don't know, maybe this is wrong or a bad simplification, but if you have a PlayStation, somebody built the PlayStation, but another company built the games to be played on the PlayStation. So
right.
Who made the first video games? Was it the video game the console manufacturer, or was it the person who made the actual game to be played on it? Is that a good way to explain
I think
it?
so. I think that's the best metaphor that we have right now to describe the difference between these two. I think it does come down to semantics, and like I said, it all depends on how you define computer program.
Right.
Some people might argue that somebody way later came up with the first program because hers didn't count as one. Mostly because it wasn't ran. They never did it. The machine was never finished, and thus this program was never tried out. Though in theory, mathematically, it would work.
That was going to be my next question. Would it have worked if they did try it?
Yes. I assume at some point somebody has tried to run this on a different, maybe better computer, but I think it's generally agreed that both Babbage's work and her algorithm would have worked had they finished the machine to run them.
Okay.
In 1953, more than a century after her death, Ada Lovelace's notes on Babbage's analytical engine were republished as an appendix to B.V. Bowden's Faster Than Thought, a symposium on digital computing machines. Though the engine was never finished, and thus her program couldn't be tried, the engine has now been recognized as an early model for a computer, and her notes as a description of a computer and software. So I think that's a great analogy that you made based on that. Like, he designed the computer, she was designing early software.
Right.
Lovelace and Babbage had a minor falling out when the papers were published, when he tried to leave his own statement criticizing the government's treatment of his engine as an unsigned preface which could have been mistakenly interpreted as a joint declaration. When Taylor's scientific memoirs ruled that the statement should be signed, Babbage wrote to Lovelace asking her to withdraw the paper. This was the first she knew that he was leaving it unsigned, and she wrote back refusing to withdraw it. The historian Benjamin Woolley theorized that his actions suggested he had so enthusiastically sought Ada's involvement and so happily indulged her because of her celebrated name.
So was he kind of taking advantage of her just because of her name and background?
I think so. I think because he was one of these pioneering researchers, I mean, at the time, we take them for granted now, but at the time, a computer would have seemed like, a really far-fetched idea and even foolish. I mean, we talked about Alan Turing, and one of the reasons it was so hard for him to complete his work is that the British government in the 1940s was questioning the use of computers to break these codes. So even then, people were skeptical of researchers insisting that these machines could be useful. So I imagine in the mid-1800s, this was even worse. And he might have been looked at, especially by the government, as, a quack or a fool. And her name, I think, probably gave his project a little bit of credit.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
I think she expected him to have signed these papers and kind of support her work alongside him. And he kind of just wanted her name on it without putting his name on it, I guess, to avoid the criticism that might come. But it is a weird story, and it's hard to tell who is right and who is wrong in this case. There's so many, it depends on how you define it questions.
Well, I don't think we're necessarily looking at this like Charles Babbage is a bad guy here. Like, I think he's just someone who's working on totally new technology and
right,
maybe put a little faith in her because she came from a wealthier family or whatever. But now that she's like kind of improving on his project, he's a little worried about how that might change his research.
Yeah. Nonetheless, their friendship eventually recovered, and they continued to correspond. On August 12th, 1851, when she was dying of cancer, Lovelace wrote to him asking him to be her executor, though this letter did not give him the necessary legal authority to do so. Part of the terrace at Worthy Manor was known as Philosophers Walk, as it was there that Lovelace and Babbage were reputed to have walked while discussing mathematical principles.
What was Worthy Manor? Was that her home?
It was the home she spent time in during the latter part of her life when she was sick, especially when she was, dying of cancer.
Okay. So she's very similar to Rosalind Franklin.
Yeah. So back to the notes. In her notes, Ada Lovelace emphasized the difference between the analytical engine and previous calculating machines, particularly its ability to be programmed to solve problems of any complexity. She realized the potential of the device extended far beyond mere number crunching. In her notes, she wrote, "The analytical engine might act upon other things besides number, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations, and which should be also susceptible of adaptations to the action of the operating notation and mechanism of the engine. Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible of such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent." TLDR, or TL didn't understand. Basically that because the analytical engine was programmable, you could, through the use of mathematics, allow it to affect a number of different things, such as language or music or art or even ideas. And that's more of what we think of today when we use a computer. We can play music on them, we can write letters on them, but it's all still just math behind the curtain.
I feel like if you don't have a good background in computer science or even mathematics to listen to this and try to explain it, you're just going to hit like a wall. Like anyone that doesn't have that background knowledge to understand how these, math and numbers kind of compute to create everything that we see that a computer can do, if you don't have a base understanding of that, you're never going to understand it.
Right. Well, and it's really incredible to me, like just the scope of understanding and grasping these numbers. And I'm sure there's easier ways to think about this, but we talked about earlier with binary and how 8 digits is a byte. A byte will usually only stand for one character. So like the number 1 is still, 8 digits of binary code, as is the number 2 and 3 all the way through. And it's all the letters, an A, a B, or an M are 8 digits. And it's like, when you consider that and then consider what computers are doing, it makes perfect sense that there's like thousands and thousands and thousands of these bytes in your pocket, because they need that much code to represent these ideas to a computer that really only understands electricity or not electricity.
This is kind of hurting my brain, so I kind of feel bad for listeners.
Well, and you can even break it down, like when you look at your computer screen, right? You see, I see a picture of you right now in the Google Meet box. But all that is pixels, each of which has a code that tells it what color to be. And there's thousands of them that form your face and move in real time. It's bonkers. Like, yeah. It really is, I think, when you think about it, an incredible development for humanity. And, for all the good or bad it's brought us, I think it's an incredible invention. And the sheer amount of intellectual ability to develop this stuff astounds me.
Right.
So back to Ada Lovelace's notes. Her analysis was an important development from previous ideas about the capabilities of computing devices and anticipated the implications of modern computing 100 years before they were realized. So she, in addition to writing this algorithm that could be the first computer program, I think maybe the bigger thing that she did was start to touch on that, I guess, kind of special piece of realization and inspiration that these were way more than just calculators and could be way more than just calculators.
Do you get the sense that Babbage felt that way as well, or he was really only looking to invent things that could do better mathematical equations?
I think he might have realized that. I question, was it her that gave him that little nudge? Because like she was recognizing that these could be used for everything, not just math. I think he was stuck more in the like mechanical inventor world of, trying to figure out mathematical equations first.
Mm-hmm.
But I can imagine that, somebody who's a computer pioneer probably would have recognized maybe the potential, but she was one of the first to write about it.
Okay.
Walter Isaacson ascribes Ada's insight regarding the application of computing to any process based on logical symbols to an observation about textiles. When she saw some mechanical looms that used punch cards to direct the weaving of beautiful patterns, it reminded her of how Babbage's engine used punch cards to make calculations. And these, we know about the punch cards. They were used through the mid 20th century to program computers and run their calculations. So I think this connection is an interesting one, where she notes that art in the form of textiles is being made through a similar mechanical process as the early computer.
And
I guess you could even I don't know, it's almost like an early form of AI, right? Like she talked earlier about computers being able to compose music based on mathematical principles. Then we get into the whole conversation of whether that's music or not. But, that's kind of a form of artificial intelligence, is creativity in a machine.
I'm glad you bring up AI, because that might come up in your quiz later. So
Oh, good.
we'll see how much you've studied around that. Hint.
Hint. All right. Let's hope I get it. I don't know if I'm going to do well on that. I'm trying so hard to grasp all of this stuff. Even like outside of researching for this episode, I've just been trying to understand where technology is headed, and it's so complex. According to the historian of computing and Babbage specialist Doran Swade, Ada saw something that Babbage in some sense failed to see. In Babbage's world, his engines were bound by number. What Lovelace saw was that a number could represent entities other than quantity. So once you had a machine for manipulating numbers, if those numbers represented other things, like letters and musical notes, then the machine could manipulate symbols of which number was one instance, according to rules. It is this fundamental transition from a machine which is a number cruncher to a machine for manipulating symbols according to rules that is the fundamental transition from calculation to general purpose computation. And looking back from the present high ground of modern computing, if we are looking and sifting history for that transition, then that transition was made explicitly by Ada in that 1843 paper.
So what this is saying is that basically she does kind of deserve the credit for computers becoming, at least the idea that computers could become what we know them today rather than just complicated, powerful adding machines.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. I think she saw her mind was big enough and looking at a big enough picture that she saw the future going way past simple calculations. And once, like I said, this idea of having numbers represent symbols or letters or ideas or musical notes, that is coding. That is what computer programming is turning symbols into numbers which the computer can understand. So I really feel like this idea is what was one of the first to make that statement. Mm-hmm. I think people would have arrived there eventually, but it's impressive that she came up with this so early.
Right.
I mean, this is 100 years before Alan Turing would try to do it in World War II. So definitely way before her time. There is some controversy around her writing and who should get the credit for the first computer program. Though she's often referred to as the first computer programmer, some biographers, computer scientists, and historians of computing claim otherwise. Alan G. Bromley, in the 1990 article Difference and Analytical Engines, said all but one of the programs cited in her notes had been prepared by Babbage from 3 to 7 years earlier. The exception was prepared by Babbage for her, although she did detect a bug in it. Not only is there no evidence that Ada ever prepared a program for the analytical engine, but her correspondence with Babbage shows that she did not have the knowledge to do so. Bruce Collier, who later wrote a biography of Babbage, wrote in his 1970 Harvard University PhD thesis that Lovelace made a considerable contribution to publicizing the analytical engine, but there is no evidence that she advanced the design or theory of it in any way. Eugene Eric Kim and Betty Alexandra Toole consider it incorrect to regard Lovelace as the first computer programmer, as Babbage wrote the initial programs for his analytical engine, although the majority were never published. Alan Bromley also noted several dozen sample programs prepared by Babbage between 1837 and 1840, all substantially predating Lovelace's notes. Dorothy K. Stein regards Lovelace's notes as more of a reflection of the mathematical uncertainty of the author, the political purposes of the inventor, and above all, the social and cultural context in which it was written, than a blueprint for a scientific development.
So I guess what I don't understand about these criticisms is how can some of them say that there's no evidence of her writing a program or of her making any kind of contribution to advancing the design if that's what her notes were?
I think their argument, and I have trouble with some of this, I guess. I'm not a researcher and a biographer of these people. A lot of them are Babbage biographers, which leads me to be just slightly like...
They might have some bias.
Yeah, I don't want to say they're completely biased because they're still researchers and I like want to trust them, but there's a little part of me that's careful with that as far as them maybe being a little biased towards him. I mean, if you're going to write a PhD paper about Charles Babbage, I doubt you want part of it to be that he didn't really invent the first computer program. I think it's probably like most things somewhere in the middle. Like there's this side, there's this other side, and then there's the truth. But I do, it's kind of hard because I feel like she did come up with ideas that he wasn't really toying with. I almost feel like if she was able to live a lot longer and work on it, maybe she would have come up with something more concrete. But in this instance, you know, I almost feel like it would be like an early researcher with electricity just trying to get a light bulb to turn on. And then his, not assistant, but an associate of his writing notes to explain how that worked. And in those notes, you know, referenced all the things we might be able to do with electricity later on down the road. Mm-hmm. It'd still be groundbreaking, but she didn't, outside this one piece of code, this one algorithm, she didn't contribute any like hard scientific knowledge or research the way Babbage, I think, was in his descriptions of these machines and attempts to build them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I think maybe we're trying to also avoid the same bias because we're kind of talking about Ada Lovelace here, and maybe she didn't have the contribution that we're trying to make it sound like, but also like she clearly was important in changing the way we think about computers.
Right.
But maybe she didn't actually do the changing of computers. I don't know what the correct way to describe that is. So like I kind of understand it. I mean, I think when I said earlier that I had Babbage in mind as a future episode, he probably would be considered like an A-sider in the computer history field, even if most people on average probably haven't heard of him.
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense to view Ada Lovelace as like the B-sider to him because, I mean, whether she made major contributions or not, she sort of changed the way we think about computers in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I almost, like, I give her more credit philosophically than scientifically, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Because that seems to be where, to me at least, reading all of this, her contribution in that idea, in the forward-thinking part of her notes, is more important than her writing this algorithm for Bernoulli numbers. Like I said, I think somebody eventually would have done that anyway, probably soon after she did, because they were using these to compute numbers. I think it's much more groundbreaking that she was like, no, these can be used to represent everything.
Right.
Doran Swade, a specialist on the history of computing, known for his work on Babbage, discussed Lovelace during a lecture on his analytical engine. He explained that Ada was only a promising beginner instead of a genius in mathematics, that she began studying basic concepts of mathematics 5 years after Babbage conceived the analytical engine, so she could not have made important contributions to it, and that she only published the first computer program instead of actually writing it. But he agrees that Ada was the only person to see the potential of the analytical engine as a machine capable of expressing entities other than quantities. And that's pretty much what we've been saying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. The whole, like, she's just a beginner and couldn't have made important contributions to it. I understand, I guess, technically. But I also feel like if that was the case, Babbage wouldn't have been so willing to work with her. Unless he really just wanted her there for her countess name. In his self-published book, Idea Makers, Stephen Wolfram defends Lovelace's contributions. While acknowledging that Babbage wrote several unpublished algorithms for the analytical engine prior to Lovelace's notes, Wolfram argues that there's nothing as sophisticated or as clean as Ada's computation of the Bernoulli numbers. Babbage certainly helped and commented on Ada's work, but she was definitely the driver of it. Wolfram then suggests that Lovelace's main achievement was to distill from Babbage's correspondence a clear exposition of the abstract operation of the machine, something which Babbage never did.
This all just feels like we're splitting hairs. Like, I know credit is important in these types of fields, especially when you're making new discoveries or inventions like this, but it just seems like they had different views on the goals of what this machine could be.
Right. And I think this is a perfect example of kind of what's going on in the computing world right now, where they were both good researchers and both good mathematicians and both good computer programmers and thinkers. And they both were able to contribute unique aspects of their own personalities to the work. And that's a good thing, right? Without Ada, we wouldn't have this other algorithm or this idea that computers could represent more than numbers. Without Babbage, we would have no engine at all from which to start. Mm-hmm. So they're better together than they are on their own or not at all. And I think that's kind of what you're seeing now, where people are calling for a much more diverse group of computer programmers to reduce bias and have more creativity and elegance when writing programs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's just something that we see a lot whenever we have new technologies or developments, research happening, that you see teams of people, and when you start trying to assign credit to one specific person, it gets a little messy on who contributed what.
Oh, humans and their egos. Ada Lovelace died at the age of 36 on November 27th, 1852, from uterine cancer.
She's really young. I mean, we've referenced Rosalind Franklin a lot, but I think, weren't they about the same age when they died?
Yeah.
Both from
cancer. She was really young. Yeah, and that's why I said I wonder what she might have been able to accomplish had she lived a little bit longer.
Right.
And I think we probably said the same thing about Franklin.
Mm-hmm.
The illness lasted several months, in which time her daughter Annabella took command over whom Ada saw and excluded all of her friends and confidants. Why her daughter did this, I don't know. It just seems like this whole family has weird stuff going on from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And I guess to make it even weirder, Ada was buried at her request next to her father at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. A memorial plaque written in Latin to her and her father is in the chapel attached to Horsley Towers.
I mean, we mentioned before that it seemed odd that she'd be buried next to her father, but I guess for the reasons we talked about in the first half, there must have been some kind of connection there.
Yeah, I don't know if the connection was that her mother had just really damaged their relationship and made her question whether or not her father was truly insane, or if she was buried next to him for, historical clout. I think that would be a silly reason, but...
I mean, that's kind of where my mind went. Yeah, I mean, he's got some significance to his name and their family history, so being buried with him would make her a part of that family line.
And she also named one of her children after him, so she can't have hated him that much.
Right.
I feel like I wouldn't name my firstborn after my father if I hated him. So clearly there wasn't too much bad blood.
Yeah, I guess not.
But yeah, I think in terms of the overall question, who gets credit, I think maybe the answer is just don't. That's not maybe a good way to think about this, and that it's better that both of them get a little bit of credit because we got more out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. So do you think you know enough about computer science and Ada Lovelace?
Absolutely not. But let's charge ahead, full steam, blind
right.
optimism. We'll be right back.
All right, it's time to get into today's quiz. We like to end every episode with just a short 3-question quiz to test today's host, see how much he's studied around his topic, and maybe you, the listener at home, has been following along or knows a bit about our topic and can kind of play along and guess the answers as we go. Hope you studied up on your computer science, Matt.
Ooh, we'll see.
Computer programming, how to write code, because none of that is in this quiz.
Great.
I do think the questions are going to be pretty difficult. I would think that they were difficult, but you did the research and not me. But none of them have to do with computer science, I don't believe. They're all specifically about or connected to, in some way, Ada Lovelace. Are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. Question number 1. There are 6 original copies of her notes from the 1843 Sketch of the Analytical Engine. 3 of those copies are at Harvard, 1 is at the University of Oklahoma, and 1 is at the U.S. Naval Academy. The last copy was sold at auction to an anonymous buyer in July of 2018 for what price?
Oh, God.
I can give you multiple choice if you'd like it.
I'm going to guess like 10 million.
You are way above it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was actually, I guess, less than I expected it to be, but not like cheap.
1 million.
Still above it? Yeah.
Well, if I keep going down, eventually I'll hit it.
It was sold for £95,000, which is the equivalent of $124,000, around that.
That's cheaper than I would have expected. But I guess there's 6 copies of it, but
yeah, the rest are all at universities for whatever reason. I mean, obviously I understand why, but why does Harvard need 3 of them?
Harvard gets preferential treatment.
Apparently. Question number 2. Ada Lovelace Day is an annual event which recognizes women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and aims to create new role models for girls and women in these fields. This holiday began in 2009 and is celebrated when?
I want to say on her birthday. I mean, that's the only date I can remember that I could even throw out. So December 10th would be my guess.
It's not on her birthday. I don't know why the date was picked. Like, it had nothing to do with anything that you said in the episode, but it's celebrated on the second Tuesday in October every year. So this year it'll be on October 11th. And that's 2022 for people who might be listening to this years from now.
Well, that's over 2.
I told you this quiz is difficult, but they're all kind of connected. Your third question, and this one was really interesting to me, even if it's not about her specifically. Ada, which is spelled A-I-D-A, is a humanoid robot named after Ada Lovelace. So I think the name is kind of a pun. Ada, A-I-D-A.
Yeah.
So it's a humanoid robot, and what that means, it's a robot that's designed to look and kind of act like a human. It was named after her, and it is capable of doing what?
I have three possible guesses.
Let's hear them.
I would say, like, I don't want to say walking. I think I'm going to throw walking out because I think they all are trying to make them walk.
Yeah, that's too
I'm going to say holding a full conversation or maybe playing a game of chess.
Like Alexa. There's a competition. This doesn't have anything to do with the question, but there's a competition, I guess, that Amazon sponsors. I think it's Amazon sponsors every year, where people try to write programs for Alexa to be able to have a full conversation with a person before, like, getting stuck in its algorithmic rotation to not be, like, conversational anymore. And, like, the whole competition is to see how long the conversation can go on with just a human moderator, and then also, like, if it seems realistic, like if a third party was listening to it, if it sounded like a normal conversation happening or a person talking to a machine.
Right.
Anyway, that's not the answer to this. You were wrong on both the years.
Oh, great.
But I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, no, that is interesting.
So Ada, the robot, is credited with being the world's first ultra-realistic robot artist. It's able to draw people from sight with a pencil using her bionic hand and cameras in her eyes.
Interesting. I guess it kind of makes sense because she was referencing machines being able to do artwork.
Yeah, so
that's cool.
Yeah, I'd be curious to watch that. I should have looked up videos or pictures of some of her drawings. A little creepy, but it'd be kind of cool to just walk up to a robot and have them draw you.
That's what I thought. I saw a video of one that had like a face that could make expressions, and it reminded me of that Will Smith movie, I, Robot, where they have like humanoid faces, but they're still real creepy looking.
So I do have a bonus question for you as well.
Oh, goody.
And I don't expect you to get this, but maybe you will because it's related to our podcast. So Ada's father, Lord Byron, his father, which would be Ada Lovelace's grandfather, shared a nickname with one of our previous B-siders. What was it?
Oh my god. Oh no.
I don't know how I found this, but I did.
One of our previous B-siders. He wouldn't have been on the Titanic.
Well, think about nicknames from our previous B-siders. Do you want the guy's name?
Sure.
John Byron.
John Byron. I don't know, and now that I have to think of our episode titles, I can't. I have no idea. That's a good question.
So
was he anti-Santa?
No. John Krampus Byron. John Mad Jack Byron.
Oh.
But he was only referred to by the name Mad Jack in an obituary that was written about his son, Lord Byron. It was really weird. Like, he was never, there's no reference of him ever being referred to as John Mad Jack Byron except in Lord Byron's obituary that said, like, son of Mad Jack Byron.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's no connection between Jack Churchill and John Byron, but just funny that they were both called Mad Jack, apparently.
Lord Byron just, like, made that up. Just like, I'm going to give my dad a better name.
My dad was crazy. He was Mad Jack.
As always, we really appreciate our listeners for tuning in each week to learn with us. We certainly enjoy putting the episodes together and are glad you enjoy listening. Please feel free to reach out to us at historiesbside@gmail.com or find us on social media at historiesbside. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service. And follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can donate to the show at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. While you're there, check out our membership perks, merchandise, and more.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
and Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.